it's Helen from the Squiggly Careers podcast. I hope you're well. I want to take just a few minutes to tell you about this week's Squiggly Careers podcast episode, what we're covering, why we're covering it, and then give you a little bit of an insight into some of the things that we talk about. So first of all, the topic: when is it good enough to be great? And why are we talking about that? Because lots of people get in their own way at work. The desire to make things perfect, the perfectionism pressure that creates for people is quite significant, and it gets in the way of people's growth all the time. It can also be off-putting for other people that they work with, because it can feel like you're not giving people the freedom and flexibility to work on things in the way that works for them, because they feel like they have to work on it in the way that works for you. So as a manager, it can lead to micromanagement. As a colleague, it can sometimes feel quite sort of defensive about the work that you're doing, and you're not kind of involving other people. And so closes down relationships, reduces your impact, stops you experimenting and exploring. We're not saying that none of your work should be great. What we are saying is that be conscious of what work needs that level of attention, and also be aware of what work you can let go so it can go further and faster, and it doesn't need you to be the person who owns it throughout that process. And so on the podcast, talk about two things: how you can self-assess where you're starting from with this, which is what I'm going to talk to you about now, and then what you might do so that you can consciously spend more time in this sort of open zone of good enough. So let me talk about the self-assessment, and then you can listen to the podcast if you're like, yes, this may be a challenge for me, and I may need some squiggly career support. So the matrix, 2 dimensions to this matrix. The first dimension is basically how much you care about the work. So do you have a high level of care? So you want this to do well, you feel really personally invested in it. Or maybe you have a low level of care, not particularly connected to it, not really kind of bothered what happens with this particular piece of work. That's the first dimension. The second dimension is all about control. So in terms of how much control you want over the work, is that a high level of control? So you feel the need to see this through. You kind of want to really define how this work gets done, and you're finding it hard to let it go, that kind of a thing. Or have you got a desire for a lower level of control? You don't need to be the person that does it. You might want it to get done, but you don't need to be the person who's kind of managing every moment in that particular project. So these are the dimensions that we are going to focus on. And depending on how you respond to the care versus the control determines how you might be managing your work and coming across to your colleagues at the moment. So let's start with this box down here, first of all. So this is where you have a high need for control, but you have a sort of a low level of care. This can come across as being very territorial about your work. So it sort of sounds like, well, it's my job, so I need to do it. Now, you might not be the right person to do it, but this sort of defensiveness about your work can be quite difficult for your colleagues. And it can also reduce the quality of the work, because obviously other people might do things better than us. And so if you're holding on to it, maybe it's for ego, maybe it's for kind of fear that you don't want other people to think you can't do it. It might not be best for the work, might not be best for the team. So it's kind of worth being aware of that. I think I can sometimes fall into this, because I think, well, I need to do it. This is my job. I need to do it. So you're not a bad person if this is where you fall, but just be aware that it might create some challenges for you and the way that you're working with other people. Now let's go to this one down here. So this is where you've got a low level of control. You're not really bothered about how the work gets done, and you've also got a low level of care. You're not really bothered about what happens to the work. Now, this is when you can come across as very detached from the work that you're doing, and the risk here is really to your reputation, because you might, in other people's eyes, be associated with that piece of work, but you're just like letting it go out into the world, and who knows what's going to happen to it. And it might not go well. It might cause issues. Other people might have opinions about you and your work, which you're not very in control of. You're not proactively managing that, and who knows what's going to happen. This level of detachment often comes either when people aren't they're not really enjoying their job. I'd say the reflection there is, are you the right person to be doing that job? Or when people are trying to get so much done, they are so driven by doing that they're just putting everything out into the world. It's sort of like I'm just going to send it and see, that they lose that sense of quality that's really important to them. So being detached is not a great place to be. Now, over here, this top one up here is where you have a high level of care. So you're like really passionate about the work that you're doing, and you also have a high need for control. So this is when you are very attached to the work that you're doing. And you might think, well, isn't it good to be attached? To some things, maybe. To everything, no. Because you get over attached. You sort of over identify with the work. It can come across as very controlling. You don't allow other people to be creative. It ultimately puts an awful lot of pressure on you. And it also becomes a problem for other people too. So we don't want you to be spending all of your time with everything that you do, having a super high level of care and a super high need for control, because it's going to get in a lot of people's way if that's how you're working. So be aware of that. It often sounds like, and I hear this at work because Sarah sometimes falls into this area, working on a project and someone says, oh, if you could just scan over this for me, or I've got it 90% there, could you just have a quick look? And you might be thinking, oh, actually, I want more than a quick look. I don't want to be the person that has like is a tick box at the end of the process. I have an opinion, I have insight, and actually maybe I don't agree with everything that you've done, but you've not given me the permission to kind of input in a different way. And that can be quite frustrating for people. And again, the work might be better if you could manage that differently. So where we're really trying to get to is this box over here, where you have a high level of care, like you want that work to do well, you're passionate about the work that you're doing, but you're also willing to let it go so that work can grow. You can give it to other people to build on. And this is the open zone that we're aiming for. This is the zone of good enough that we're trying to get to. And there are certain things that you might be working on where you can recognize, I care about this work and I think it would be better if someone else built on it. And it's that identification that this isn't about you, this is about the work that you do, and that work would be better if you can let it go. And I'm not saying, it's not that kind of detached, just let it go and see. You're going to do that very consciously. Who's the best person to build on it? Who's got insight that I haven't? Who could take this further than I can right now? It's being specific about who and what and when you're letting that piece of work go to, but the work will be better because of it. And you can then free up some of your time to go give that, strong level of attention onto the work that you need to make great. So the starting point is, where do you sit on this matrix? And then what we are doing in the podcast episode is giving you loads of ideas for action so that you can spend more time in that zone of good enough. So hopefully this is a helpful summary of the matrix. It's hard to talk about a matrix on a podcast because they are kind of visual things. So hopefully this has brought the sort of concept to life for you. And then if you recognize this as a career conundrum, you can listen to the podcast episode and get ideas for action to help you. Podcast is Squiggly Careers. You can find it pretty much everywhere. And if you ever can't find an episode, email us. We're Helen and Sarah at squigglycareers.com.